I'd like to invite Ramin Ganeshram to come and to join me. For a time of conversation, our second in a series we've been calling Faith in Action. A series that we conceived of as a way of having conversations not just among us, but with others in our community, leaders who are engaged in work that we admire, in order to have the excuse to ask the question, how do you make the connections between that work that you do and your own life of faith or spirituality? I am so grateful that you have said yes to coming and being with us this morning.
It's my honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Ramin, I've mentioned, is the executive director over at the Museum of the Westport Museum of History and Culture, just down the street. Some of you may know that they have been doing some research in our own Evergreen Cemetery, in particular over these last couple of years, and have been sharing some of their findings with us. We are also delighted that just this week, they started a new project with Saugatuck Church. They are going through our archivable and maybe less than archivable materials, all of the stuff that we have stashed away in boxes at Saugatuck Church to help us discern what we need and want to save and to archive those materials for us. And we are thrilled that you are embarking on that project with us too. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Some of the treasures that we've already gotten a peek at are exciting. So Ramin, as we step out into this conversation, I would love to ask you two questions, one about your work as a historian and one about your faith background, and maybe you can pick which one you want to start with first, but I'm curious to know where you trace the origins of your love for history, whether there's a first. I know that there's a story behind that.
Yeah.
And then what you might say about the faith or the spirituality with which you were raised.
So that's a really sort of intense question, and I'll endeavor to answer it. But to answer it, I actually have to start with history, which is my own family history, which is it's a bit unusual, I guess. I've come to learn that the older I get, how unusual it is. So to start with, my mother was from Iran. She was from a Kurdish family in Iran. Some of you may know this is a tribal Middle Eastern culture. She was raised Muslim. She converted to Christianity, but what you need to know about Iran, and some of you I know this, is that in its ancient culture, the original religion of which was Zoroastrianism. And it never left Iran, even as Islam became the regular religion, or the main religion. So for us, we still celebrate Zoroastrian holidays as our main holidays, which are very nature-based holidays. So for example, our new year is going to be the spring equinox. It'll be this year, March 20th or 21st. And it is as big as a holiday to Iranians, although they are Muslim, as Christianity is in the Christian world, as Christmas is in the Christian world. And then my mother converted to Christianity as a young woman and came to the United States as a nurse for the Red Cross. My father was from Trinidad and Tobago, which is a very ethnically mixed culture. It's primarily West African, East Indian, Chinese, Syrian, and so on. So we're all very ethnically mixed in Trinidad, and so here's what this means. My father, within his family, what was observed was Hinduism, Catholicism, Orisha or Obeah, Western African religions, Islam in some cases, Presbyterianism, and Anglicanism. So when you go to a household in Trinidad, a faithful household, it would not be unusual, perhaps not so much now, but when I was a child, to see an altar that had a picture of a Hindu god, a West African god, or an idol or an image, Jesus Christ, the Prophet Muhammad,
A laughing Buddha.
A laughing
right?
Buddha. Like it was all there. And it was done with earnestness. You know, it wasn't kind of like, let me cover my bases. I joke this about myself. People say, you know, may I give you a blessing? I'm like, yes, I will take them all. It doesn't matter. You know, so I say this to say that in two ways, you know, I come from a very, if not actively, just tolerant religious background, right? Because there's a really real potential that if you chose to be intolerant, you were offending someone in your own family, in your own circle, right? So you had to learn to be tolerant. The other aspect of it is that all of these things that I just described to you are intimately wrapped up in history, because it is the movement of history, it's the movement of colonialism, it's the movement of tribes, it's the movement that created this circumstance in my particular family. So that's one reason that I sort of became, you know, history was very close to us at all times. The other thing that was very close to us at all times was the idea of our ancestors, particularly in my father's family, because you're talking about ancestors that came bound to the New World in service of colonial empires. And so a lot of hardship. And so it was very important to us to feel that our ancestors moved on from this realm to a place where they had power, and they had power to look after us. So that's very close to me every day. And in the work that we do at the museum, we often talk about the ancestors speaking to us, guiding us. The work we're doing in the cemetery of this church is very much guided in that. The things we've been led to do that for no other reason have come to bear. And we could, you know, talk about that a bit. But.
I love that. Maybe, why don't you tell us the story of the Adair family, and then we'll go back, and I'd like to hear the story you shared with me about your father that sparked some of your interest in history as well. But let's start with the Adairs in our own Evergreen Cemetery.
Sure. So I happen to live next door to Evergreen Cemetery, so I'm there all of the time, and particularly during the pandemic, in the early days, if you remember, we all thought we couldn't even leave the confines of our yards, right? We were so terrified. And I would just go next door to the cemetery and kind of pace between the stones. So I had said we have a very, very gifted researcher and genealogist at the museum. Her name is Sarah Krasny. And I had said to her, let's catalog this cemetery, the stones. Some of them are quite old. If we don't take down the inscriptions, they're going to be lost. Let's photograph them and write down the inscriptions. So we did in that first summer, 2020, kind of wearing masks in the summer. We just like sat there in front of each stone and took it down. There's an enclosure actually quite near my house that was very interesting. It was a whole family called Adair, beautiful stones, clearly a family of means. An enclosure, which is unusual, right? You have to have been a family means to have your own enclosure. We just got interested in them. Sarah actually got interested in them. And she started saying, I'm going to look these people up because these stones are amazing. So she does. And then she calls me and she said, you're not going to believe this, but the patriarch of this family, Benjamin Adair, was African American. It's very likely he was enslaved in the South. He was born in South Carolina. He came up to New York to work for Morris Ketchum, which is a name some of you will know from Westport's history, who owned a house that is still there called Hockanum on Cross Highway, and then came to Westport with him and worked as his coachman. So the interesting thing about the Adair family is this, that Benjamin bought some land in Saugatuck, later sold it to the railroad for 4 times its value, 3 or 4 times its value, then bought 9 acres from Morris Ketchum and had a farm that he called a homestead that he managed to keep in his family for maybe 100 years. You all know this property, even though you don't think you know this property. And how many of you are familiar with Exit 42 on the Merritt Parkway? Yes, and that wonderful intersection that we all love, the one that makes no sense whatsoever, the intersection of terror. So that intersection it was carved out of the Adair property. The Adair property is actually, when you come down Main Street, it's to the left. If you come down Route 57, the Weston Road, it's to your right? So here's what happened to the Adair family. When Benjamin Adair died, he put in his will that at no cost, in no way should this homestead be broken up, lost, or sold. He tasks his descendants to keep this property. And they manage to hold on to it for another 75 or 80 years. They're very prominent, they do quite well. At some point in history, though, it's only his granddaughters who are remaining. And I think his wife may have been alive at that time. And they can't hold on to the property because the town of Westport starts raising their taxes. To the point where by the 1930s, the town of Westport raised the taxes twice in 1 year. So let's say it was, for argument's sake, 1,000 this year, it's 2,000 next year. But none of their neighbors' property taxes were raised at all. So this was very interesting to us for a lot of reasons. It speaks to a lot of issues that we talk about today: fair housing, housing segregation, and so on. And so in doing this work, we tried to find the descendants of Benjamin Adair, and we did find them. And when I reached out to them, they were just amazed that, and his great-great-granddaughter said to us, I'm so thankful that you brought us into the light, out of the darkness. You proved that our family existed and had value in Westport, and we were part of Westport, and we were important, and we progressed. And we're still in contact with them. We're still doing work with them, the Adair family. So yes, that's the story of Benjamin Adair.
So when I first invited Ramin, and she said, I'll take the first Sunday of Women's History Month, and then I looked at the scripture and saw that it was the story of Lazarus, the connection that I made was to the work you do, calling out of the tombs the people and the histories that have been obscured, including the histories of women and people of color whose stories often aren't told. And this is a wonderful example of how that happens because of your research and Sarah's and the
Mostly
work of the
Sarah,
museum.
I have to say.
Yeah.
I just come up with harebrained ideas, and she just goes, and tries to find a way to do it. So it's really Sarah.
But I love your saying, and I just want to come back to it in case anyone missed it, that observation that you feel called by the ancestors to bring those stories to light. Mm-hmm. Can you say just a word more about that in terms of walking around that Evergreen Cemetery and the connections that you make there? What it means for you to be listening to the ancestors?
I think so. For me, because of the peculiarity of my family, as it is, it's very hard for me personally to trace people very far back, right? So in Iran, it's a different language. It's an oppressive regime. I don't really know much about my family, right? So I'll give you an example. When I was pregnant with my daughter, my husband wanted to name her Sophia. That is her name, right? And I was like, no, it's okay, it's fine, but it's not my favorite name, right? And it just so happened that we were doing some work with property in Trinidad, and I had to get my parents' marriage license to prove my legitimacy for that project. And essentially, I didn't know my grandmother's name, my mother's name. I never knew it because she died when my mother was 5 years old. And this longevity of people around us in a present sense and being able to go back and talk to family, it didn't exist. So we get the marriage license, the marriage certificate, and my husband had happened to open it. And he walked up to me and he said, I win. Her name is going to be Sophia, because my grandmother's name was Sophia. Or Safia is what it would have been, right? So, and in my father's family, we just cannot go back very far. We can only go back with respect, again, because of lost records. It was a British colony. One great-grandfather who had been indentured from India. So I feel like all I had is to talk to them spiritually, right? Because I don't know enough about them. And so when I go through that cemetery, or the Greens Farms Church Cemetery, I try to be in tune to whosoever may need to speak. And I often feel that it's people who had no voice in life, right? And I think that spiritually, I just happen to believe that, sort of like Einstein, really, that time is relative. And, I often tell you what's my favorite quote in the world is from Hamlet in Shakespeare, where he says to his friend, Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. And that's how I kind of approach my life. Just because I can't see it and feel it doesn't mean it isn't true, so I try to be open. So when I go to that cemetery, I'm always kind of trying to listen.
So listening for those voices, particularly the ones who might not always be remembered, is something that you picked up from your father, among other places. Would you share that story that you shared with me about one of the ways that you got interested in history?
Sure. So, and this is a funny story because it relates to work that I've been doing for 12 years outside of the museum, history work. And it never occurred to me until recently, because obviously sometimes I'm not quick on the uptake, that relates to the other, and it's this. So when I was 8, the United States had its bicentennial celebration of American independence, and my father felt it was really important for my brother and I, coming from disparate backgrounds, to really identify as Americans. And this was not uncommon at the time, right? If you spoke a different language at home, you were not encouraged to do so. You were encouraged to assimilate in totality. And he really wanted us to embrace that. So he decided that he was going to take us to historic sites around the United States and the Eastern Seaboard, specifically for the purpose of really appreciating our American history. So we went to Philadelphia, saw the Liberty Bell, saw everything there, and that's where I kind of got this sense where I was like, there's no one here like us. Like I was looking at my father, and I was looking at the other people, and looking at my mother, and I'm thinking, we don't exactly fit in, right? When they're talking about the history and these men and these Minutemen and these militia, I'm like, but whatever, I was a little kid, right? So it kind of passed in and out of my awareness. But we went to Mount Vernon. And this is the first time I remember really being amazed that there's something in this history thing. We're touring the house, and the guide, a lady, we were in the Washington bedroom, and she picked up, sorry, this is not very genteel, but I will say it.
It's okay.
She picked up the chamber pot, and she said, does anyone know what this is? And no one did. And my father said, I know what that is. That's a Poe, or a chamber pot. And she said, yes, that's right. And if they needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, they would use this instead of going out to the outhouse. Actually in Trinidad, up until really the 80s in rural areas, people were still doing this, right? So I even knew what that was, right? And my father said, who emptied it? And they said, this lady said, well, the servants. And he said, the servants? Who are the servants? And she said, well, the servants that worked in the Washington household. And my father said, you mean the slaves? Which I just want to be clear, it's not a term we now use. We say enslaved people, but this is, a very long time ago, right? So she said, well, yes. And then she kind of whatever. And so every room that we went in, my father had a question about who really did this work. And, I remember the guide was getting agitated, the people we were with were agitated, and my father was getting angrier and angrier and angrier. I had never seen him do this, frankly, because like many people of color, particularly men of color, he knew how to hold on to himself in mixed society, right? He never showed anything that could be seen as violence or anger or aggression, right? So we go over he asks where the quarters were. At the time, it was actually a gift shop. They had turned them into a gift shop. Angrier still, and I'm watching my father, right? And I remember the tour ended at the gravesite of Martha and George Washington, and I just remember feeling terrified. A real sense of terror around American history and what it meant for people like us. And that stayed with me. And so I kind of, from that point, became obsessed, not just with history at large, but particularly American history. I felt I had to unpack this. What was this about? And understand that Caribbean history is intimately tied up with American history. These colonies here were in service of the colonies in the Caribbean, which were really the economic engine of the colonizing powers.
So why now does it remain important to call those stories out, to unbind the Lazarus, which is the untold history or untold histories in our background.
You know, I think the story of Lazarus is such a perfect parable. It's such a perfect example of what we're talking about. You know, because when he says he's been in there for days and there's a stench, right? You know, history that's not revealed rots. And even though there may be a door in front of it, maybe there's a lid on top of it, and everyone feels like as long as we talk about it, everything is okay, it's festering behind that door, inside that drawer, inside that locked vault. And that harms everyone, right? So I think that, you know, to bring things in, I know from our work, to bring things into the light is to give it healing, give those things healing, not just for those who were oppressed, but those who may have been oppressors, and the descendants of both. And it's not necessarily about punishing people in the present for whatever their roles were in the past. But if we don't understand history, we will be doomed to continue to repeat this behavior. And I think unless you understand the motivations and the mechanisms of systemic oppression or systemic wealth or systemic movements in society, you cannot really understand the emotional impact they have on people.
I want to hold on to that observation that this is both, it's work for all of us. It is naming a history which may be uncomfortable, but as we've said before, being uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not true or shouldn't be told, right? Sometimes it's just uncomfortable. And the healing isn't just for those whose stories are being told. The healing is for all of us.
That's right.
There's an Aboriginal leader, a woman who once said, if you are coming, she was talking about sort of missionary work, and she said, if you are coming here to help me, you're wasting my time. But if you're here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.
Right.
So as we're talking about unbinding, I also think of that way that we are bound up together in this work. So what sustains you, and what do you do when it gets hard?
So I have to say the thing that sustains me the most is my child. I think those of you who are parents know what I mean when I say this, or have children in your life. And I just keep reminding myself when it gets hard that what I'm trying to do is unpack a burden and repackage it as a treasure for her to carry with her to go forward, right? To be sustained, to feel pride, to feel that she belongs somewhere and she belongs to people, and she belongs to her community. And so that keeps me going. It keeps me going not just in terms of my child, but other people's children. I can tell you that one of the proudest things for us at the museum is actually not all the awards we've received recently, and we have, you know, and I'm very grateful for that, you know, and it's not the recognition, it's not even the increased visitation or the donations. These are things that we are grateful for. What we're really, really grateful for that is sustaining is that we have so many youth volunteers, we actually have to turn them away. So 85% of our volunteers are teenagers. So our volunteer base goes from age 13 to 93. But the greatest bulk of them are high school students from Staples High School, from Wilton High School, Weston High School, Greens Farms Academy. And they're doing meaningful work. They're doing archival work, they're installing exhibitions, they're doing research, and some of them come to us because they have to do volunteer work for their graduation, but what we're proud of is that they stay.
Yeah.
And that they graduate and go to college, and they come back in the summers, and they ask to work with us. I will tell you a very funny story. So my daughter came to see me in my office when there was a bunch of kids working on it, whatever they were doing. I think they were painting something. And one of them says to the next one, two young women, gosh, it's always been my dream to come volunteer here. And my daughter, great PR person, she goes, really? Why? And I was like, thanks. Maybe you don't come here, but the rest of the kids, so we're very proud of that. That's what sustains us, I think.
I love that. I'm sure that both you and Sophia know that the name Sophia also means wisdom. And it sounds like she is an inspiring force for you, as our children often are. I don't know if she's watching and whether she's patting herself on the back right now. I also just want to capture that line and make sure you heard Ramin say that what she's doing is trying to unpackage or unwrap a burden and repackage it as a treasure. What a remarkable way of describing the work to which we're called and to which you're called. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
We have a practice at Saugatuck Church of blessing people and things and spaces, and we would like to thank you for your time among us by offering you a blessing. And I know, because you already said, that you will take all the blessings you can get. So I'm going to invite our folks in the space and watching online to find the love and energy in your hands and just extend those hands to offer that love up this way towards Ramin. And join your hearts with mine as we say, God of many names, pour out your blessing on Ramin today. We give you thanks for the work that she does, for her faithful listening to the ancestors, for her digging into the ground of our history and calling forth the stories that are longing for the light. Give her the courage she needs and the patience. Bless her with open ears and open heart. Send her the stories that are waiting to be told, and shower her with the assurance of gratitude felt by those who are brought to light. We pray your sustaining power in her life, wisdom, and love. We ask it in your holy name. Let the people say amen. 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 Ramin, thank you so much for this time. We're going to have you back, certainly after you dig into some of our treasures, so that we can tell some of those stories together. So I look forward to continuing this.
Thank you so much.
Would you welcome Ramin and thank you?
Thank you very much.